Well, it looks like we're in the midst of another round of fighting between President Trump and Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York. Now, this is, of course, over the Wu flu pandemic that's been going on now, I guess since the beginning of this year, really, you could say at this point. And ever since the pandemic really set in New York, there's been conflict on and off between Cuomo and Trump. At first, Cuomo was saying how basically we needed to shut everything down, that the president needed to come in and essentially declare martial law. He needed to send in the tanks. He needed to lock down the state of New York, New York City, and the surrounding states. Actually, he was calling, I believe Cuomo was basically implying that Trump needed to do a national lockdown, but at the very least, a regional lockdown, and that he thought the federal government should lead that, and essentially was begging the military to come in and usurp his power. He seemed to indicate that the civilian government of New York had no role to play in this pandemic, and that they should just be swept aside, by the winds of history. But slowly his tune began to change. As I guess Cuomo started to take charge of things and was getting lots of praise in the media, then Cuomo seemed to like this whole, states' rights thing, which, again, from the beginning, that was kind of Trump's approach, was he's saying, hey, we don't want to lock down the whole country because that would cause problems, which I outlined at the time. Enforcement-wise, it's just impossible to have a national lockdown. So Trump was basically saying, hey, let's just let the governors do as they please in each of their states, and they'll make the right decisions. They're closer to the problem. Good logic. And slowly Cuomo kind of settled into that. He embraced it quite a bit. He's fully embraced it at this point. But as we've, gone along over these past few weeks, Trump has been getting a little restless with respect to all these lockdowns and things, and has indicated that he feels that a lot of these states have gone too far in locking down, their people, which I'm certainly sympathetic to that point. I don't think that a government-enforced lockdown at all is really that good of a deal. I just think that if you don't lie to people and don't tell them not to wear masks and don't tell people that, this isn't something that they should worry about, that people will do the right thing on their own. Before, even the restaurants were closed here in Florida, I remember distinctly going to a restaurant that was in the side of a shopping mall, and the mall parking lot was empty, which I'd never seen it, and the restaurant was empty. There were like 3 tables filled in the whole place. And that's back when we had all this misinformation, and the government, including Trump, was still trying to downplay this whole threat from the virus and say, oh, it's just the flu, bro. Even then, people were on their own making, good decisions to try and do social distancing, as the meme has become, which I don't like using that term anymore because now it's just been, appropriated by the state. And so if I were a governor, that would be my approach. But you've got places like New York, or I should say actually Michigan, because New York's not the most oppressive state, certainly when it comes to these lockdowns from what I've seen. They've had some pretty egregious examples to where cops will, arrested a guy for playing in the park with his daughter, in front of his child, took her dad to jail. They've certainly pulled stuff like that, but Michigan seems to be by far the worst, to where people aren't even allowed to do yard work outside. They just kind of have to stay in their house and mope about, and you're not allowed to work or do anything. And the governor there is basically like Kamala Harris, but white. So just a total nag, a nanny, and a narc. Or as, people say on the internet, a Karen. And so I've certainly, been sympathetic to Trump's sentiment recently regarding how certain states, are locking down too tight and perhaps going too long. Now, I don't agree with the too long thing, because the timetable on trying to get rid of this virus is going to be very long, until we reach herd immunity. So the correct point, I think, is in talking about the mandatory things, the arbitrary things, the stuff about trying to break up people in church parking lots who are all sitting in their cars, not next to each other, not coughing on each other, not sitting next to each other, but listening through a loudspeaker, but on the premises of their church, breaking up gatherings like that. That's just that's ridiculous. It's absurd. It's tyrannical. But now Trump, as of today, is saying, and yesterday, is saying that, I think that when, the time comes that we reopen the U.S. economy, the whole thing, he's just going to do it. And that Trump has the authority to do this, and he's going to tell all the governors, hey, take off your restrictions, we're going back to work. and that that'll just happen, and that he's going to be the one making that decision. That I have a big problem with. That's Trump taking the exact wrong approach. And before I get more into that, what is the correct approach if you have governors who are overstepping their power and doing, things that I think both I and Trump would agree are, bad things that they shouldn't be doing, like breaking up, church services, impinging on people's First Amendment rights, attempting in some states to close gun stores, although they've been getting sued over that, so I don't think too many places are trying to keep people from buying guns, thankfully. I would have thought that would have been one of the first things they tried. But in any of these cases, to where, people are not, endangering the health of others around them, you should be able to sue them for violating the constitutional rights of their citizens. Now, of course, I personally think that the incorporation doctrine, which applies the U.S. Bill of Rights to the states, is bad precedent in a legal sense. But what I think personally does not matter. What matters is what the Supreme Court says. And I think that if you took a lot of these cases before the Supreme Court, if the federal government decided to sue these states for violating the rights of their citizens, I think that they would win in court. And so Trump, frankly, rather than just issuing some proclamation, like he's the king, telling all the states they have to open up, what he should do is just sue them, the legal way, and for violating people's rights. Because Trump has no authority to just override the decisions of a state governor. If a state governor vetoes a bill, Trump can't come in behind him and sign the bill into law. The states and the federal government are, legally separate entities. They interact with each other, that have certain obligations to one another, but they are not the same thing. It's not a direct hierarchy. The president is not above governors in a sense. The president is parallel to governors. The governors and the president have different jobs. And so what Trump is doing by essentially talking like a king is he's somehow ceding the whole states' rights argument and federalism to Andrew Cuomo, of all people. The guy who not too long ago was begging the federal government to come in and seize power and overthrow him in a coup, essentially. He wanted his state to be invaded by the army. He wanted them to send in the tanks and declare martial law. That's what he didn't come out and directly say that, but that's heavily what he was implying. And he was saying not just in New York, but in multiple states, and the federal government needs to be in charge. That guy is now attacking Trump from a states' rights perspective. And even Cuomo points out the irony of this in his interviews that he gave, I believe, yesterday and today. Saying, the absurdity of hearing a Republican come up here and talk like, he's the monarch, when the Republicans historically, at least, even though not in practice, but this is a general trope amongst Republicans that they support, states' rights and that, the federal overreach is a bad thing and that, the federal government, this is laughable from my perspective, that the Republicans actually think this, but the Republicans do sometimes say, when a Democrat is in power, that the federal government should only do what it is constitutionally permitted to do. That whole Article 1, Section 8 thing that gives the powers of Congress and the president is only supposed to enforce the laws passed by Congress. All that stuff, well, that's out the window right now. And now that is, what's being, the only defender of that is Andrew Cuomo. And so now that Cuomo is coming out and delivering a very, very reasonable argument about states' rights and basic constitutional law and, a basic reading of the Constitution. It's not even constitutional law, because constitutional law is this mess of a thing to where people try and, distort the Constitution and contrive it to mean other things. It's a very simple document if you sit down and read it. It's very short. You can figure it out. You don't need to be some legal scholar. So what does Trump say to all this morning after Cuomo comes out and makes a reasonable point? Well, Trump comes out and says, Andrew Cuomo wants to declare independence, and that's not going to happen, essentially calling Andrew Cuomo a neo-Confederate, which is one of those scary swear words like calling you a racist or calling you a homophobe. It's one of those misnomers to just try and shut down anyone who has a different opinion. If you ever say anything bad about the federal government, well, then you basically support slavery. That's what they're saying. I assure you, Andrew Cuomo does not want New York to be an independent state, independent of the United States. Andrew Cuomo, I think, wants to be president of the United States. I think he'd be very happy if the state of New York dominated the other 50 states and the, 4 territories or so. But in this case, he's actually in the right. Now, you can make the argument that a lot of what Cuomo's doing is itself unconstitutional, but you can't remedy unconstitutionality of one act by trying to stifle it with another unconstitutional act. You lose the legal high ground. But I guess one bright side here is that this is creating and exacerbating the conflict between the federal government and states. And so maybe this will get more people who normally wouldn't be open to a states' rights argument to look and see, ooh, Trump is this big, bad, scary dictator. We don't like Trump. And maybe, in principle, it'll open their mind a little bit to states' rights. Now, I get, that the average voter, 99% of people, do not think in terms of abstract principles and only think in terms of the moment because, they're lizard brain people when it comes to politics. But still, every little bit counts. Maybe the idea here that New York can be different from a place like Texas or Florida, or that California can be different from Wyoming. Maybe some people will start to open up their mind to that possibility. And so, just as a final thought, no, I don't really see any way that Trump could just sign some executive order ordering all these states to end their lockdowns. But perhaps the Department of Justice will consider doing something like I discussed, which is suing states that have unconstitutional lockdowns that are violating the basic Bill of Rights that people enjoy. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.